But essentially, you know, we talked about the public spaces, which were one aspect of socializing or to accept like capitalist values. There's also the written area, what's called in the period of the French Revolution the public sphere, where intellectuals, lawyers would write down ideas and make arguments, and essentially spread them through the market of written work. So this is like your Rousseau, this fucking Voltaire, all of these assholes.
What? I like Rousseau and Voltaire.
I'm being hyperbolic.
What?
I'm just...
You coming after my boy? What about the Marquis de Sade? That's my boy right there.
Do not use French words on me. I will be...
The Marquis de Sade.
I'm sorry.
That's where we get the word sadist.
Oh, I see. And this should be a reparations video, so I shouldn't be making fun of French people.
See, I told you. Yeah. I told you that we love the French here. At least I do.
So, the public sphere was essentially the market for written works, and this was made possible again by capitalist innovation, such as the printing press.
Right.
And also, public spaces like cafes and the boulevards and the promenades, all that shit.
I'm not doing well with this punch.
Is this 10? Or no,
this is
11.
Like 11. This is 11. I screwed up slightly and leveled up instead of buying Titanite shards to level this case this up. Oh, no. So I'm a little under where I want to be, but it's okay. It's all good.
Noob move, like
total noob move. Yeah, total. Yeah, I leveled up, which is a total noob move. Yeah.
Oh, but okay. So, yeah, there's, as well as the public spaces, there's the public sphere, which was made possible by capitalist innovation and is essentially like all the written works that people would make to defend or attack the revolution. And a lot like the public areas we've already talked about, the written public sphere was another place where social identities fused because, you don't necessarily know who the author of something is. They could publish it under an alias, and you don't see the person.
And as long as you could read, you could be part of the in crowd. If you're like, oh yes, I also read Hobbes, or I also read Rousseau, or whatever. You could you could rub shoulders again. As long as you could read, you could rub shoulders with anybody else that was reading that same stuff.
Exactly. And one of the key developments of this time was that the bourgeois class was learning to read and was able to read.
Yeah.
And so this was another place where the word of Benson the shopkeeper or whatever is equal to Benson the Lord.
Nope, it's Jonesman.
Jonesman the shopkeeper is equal to Benson the Lord because it's that liberal idea of the free marketplace of ideas, basically.
Yes.
Everyone's idea is supposed to be equal, and it's all made possible through the exchange of the written word at this time.
Right.
So that's another aspect of socialization. That's socialism, is that we've had relatively recently our own printing press developed called
the internet. Yep.
Yeah. And what's crazy about the internet is that it's available to literally everyone, not just, obviously you have to read, but nowadays pretty much almost everyone, at least in the US, can read. That's not like a class-based thing anymore. And you can access it like instantaneously from most places in the country. And it's a lot more accessible to a working man today than the printing press or writing was to like a peasant in the 18th century.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I want to be expressly clear that it is not as accessible as we are led to believe. And even within the United States. But I know that's a caveat. Like I know what you meant. I just want to make that explicitly clear, that we're not saying like everybody has good internet access in the United States. Like no, they don't. But it's possible to, and it's more possible than it was to get books.
Exactly.
Back in the 18th century.
And also, like the 18th century, it is like geographically based, where you're a lot more likely to have easy access to the internet in those urban spaces, which are already abstracting and, you know, encouraging of like egalitarian values than you are in rural areas.
Right.
And, you know, you can obviously look at any election map and see that one of the biggest divides in the United States is urban versus rural. And so, like, clearly things like the internet, as well as the already existing urban spaces, are much more encouraging of egalitarian values. And those things are enabled by, for large part, capitalist development. Though in the case of the internet, it's probably more like state capitalist development, because it's developed on state money.
Right.
But that's another conversation again.
Yeah.
But what's encouraging about this for socialism is that it, again, encourages this idea of abstraction, where no longer do you need to even be some intelligentsia wealthy asshole to have your opinions heard by a large portion of the population. You can literally be anyone.
Right.
Like us.
Right. Well, I mean, we're technically part of the intelligentsia, but yeah.
Yeah. But any old asshole with a phone, which is also a class-based thing.
Yeah, right.
Also, still more widely available than a book in the year 1789.
Yeah, right.
Any asshole with a phone can post whatever they want and be on an essentially equal basis as everyone else on the internet.
Now,
go ahead.
Pause, because, and if this is too off the rails, then let me know. But now, sort of the classic response to that would be, yeah, and that's why there's so much misinformation, and that's why people are, you know, getting dumber or believing in conspiracy theories and all that kind of stuff. So what is your
liberal response?
Yeah, so what is your sort of like take on that? Because it is pretty much impossible to deny that it is because of the ease of the internet that you're talking about that we do have all that. But where do you land on that?
Yeah, so, you know, it's true. It is true that misinformation is spread via the internet. That is factually correct. But that is, in my opinion, a focus on the smaller sort of exception to the rule rather than the trend of what the internet does to society. You know, most people who go on the internet don't go on to fucking 4chan and become fascists. Most people, you know, at least in my sphere that I'm aware of,
Facebook and become fascist. Yeah, got it. No.
Most people who are highly online, in my experience, are much more likely to be left or left-leaning than radicalizing to the right. In my experience,
wow, I fully disagree with that.
Well, we do come from very different spheres, you know.
Yeah.
And so that it makes sense that you would disagree with that.
Yeah, but please continue.
And I don't necessarily have data to prove this, but my hypothesis that for the most part, the egalitarianizing aspects of the internet has driven more people to the left in some fashion or degree than it has driven people to the right.
Would you, this goes against what you just said, but would you argue that it's driven people to the left or the right more than to the center? Like, would you accept that? Because I do honestly believe that it's actually pulled more people rightward, but I think more than anything, it has caused the let's say the destruction of any sort of common sense or status quo.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would agree with that at face value. Yeah. That, you know, anyone on the internet is more likely to become left or right than to stay, you know, as a centrist.
It's harder and harder for people to not have a side on something.
Exactly.
And that doesn't just imply that there are only ever two sides to anything, or it's only ever Democrat or Republican or whatever, which I I don't ever want to make that assertion, because that's not the case. But it's more likely that someone is going to pick a side, as opposed to the sort of like, well, I'm going to stay out of it kind of mentality that maybe they used to.
So I slightly lie when I say I don't have any data to back up my opinion.
Okay.
What I would point to would be the fact that young people in this country who are much more online than any of the previous generations have also been going much more to the left. Like, there's polls that say young people are much... It's a complicated issue because the fall of the Soviet Union also plays into it, but there's polls that say that young people are much more favorable to socialism in the past.
Yes.
And my expansion on this hypothesis would be that young people who are online are more likely to be driven to the left. Old people who get online are more likely to be driven to the right.
I absolutely agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I think that part of that is that young people are more online and know how to use this technology better, and also older people are already socialized to accept a lot of the capitalist or even close to fascistic hierarchies that society has.
Yes. Yes.
When they go online, they're much more likely to tend to those spaces.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, and I would add to that. No, never mind. I won't add to that. I think you're right. Yeah, I think you've got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then my further expansion on this is that I think that to a large degree, again, not to deny that there is misinformation on the internet. That's the most, truthism ever.
Yeah, right, yeah.
But I would argue that the emphasis on the degree and the idea that the internet primarily drives people to becoming Nazis or fascists is...
Did I lose you? Taylor? Taylor, where are you, buddy?
Is essentially used by the liberal class, the capitalist class, as a way to justify censorship of the left on these platforms.
Right.
And I think it's largely overblown and used, not entirely overblown, but partially overblown in service of that goal, to essentially turn people who consider themselves left against themselves.
Or to turn people who are not left against anyone dissenting online, because there's all this misinformation going around. So, like, don't listen to anyone online that isn't, one of our official sources or whatever. Did I lose you again?
All right. Yeah, no, I totally agree with everything you said there, Patrick. Yeah, that's absolutely a function of it as well. Yeah. That honestly concludes pretty much all of the notes I had.
Oh, okay. Okay, so let's do a little bit of
yeah.
Because I was thinking there was...
I think it would... Go ahead.
I was thinking there was going to be a little bit of an analysis in there. So you're saying that the improved Marxist model is the one that incorporates a bit of the cultural element and the idea of like the use of the promenades and all that stuff. Like that is like supposed to be the kind of the improved Marxist model.
The improvement, in my mind, is acknowledging that culture played a role, but that culture was materially informed. So the inherent dialectic between feudalism and capitalism is still the dominating factor in driving the French Revolution, because capitalism was what developed the institutions that developed the culture that people argued led to the French Revolution. Okay. Culture doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Okay. All right. I feel like I see what you're saying. I'm picking up what you're putting down.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That the culture has to be subservient to the material conditions, because otherwise culture would not form in the way that it does.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, sort of in that vein, what would be useful for me to do right now is to briefly sum up everything we've talked about so far. In essence, what we've talked about in this video is the original Marxist perspective on the French Revolution views it simply as a class struggle between the bourgeois and the aristocracy, the bourgeois being merchants and that sort of thing united in one class, and the aristocracy being nobles and that sort of thing united in their class, and they're struggling for different modes of society, one being capitalism, which is, which overcomes feudalism, represented by the aristocrats, and capitalism being represented by the bourgeois. We then went into critiques of that analysis, where a lot of people essentially say that the bourgeois and aristocracy were not always united in the camps they were quote unquote supposed to have been in the revolution. There were conservative and counter-revolutionary bourgeois, and there were liberal and reformist aristocrats. That is the case because the revisionists essentially just say that exists because it exists and offer no explanation for why that is the case. They just say it's culture because it's culture.
Right.
And then the Marxist development on that is that, yes, there are cultural differences, but that culture is materially informed. That the reason there are cultural differences is because of economic conditions. The economic conditions of capitalism and its development led to the differences in culture that caused there to be splits in the aristocracy and the bourgeois.
So I want to go back, because we did table it, to de Tocqueville and some of the the what I view to be legitimate ideas of well, it was sort of inevitable for the state to get stronger due to all that, and he's right, because Napoleon did come to power, and then France continued to be a imperialist nation after that, until actually still today, because it still has territories. But so you had said that there was back when I was on the bridge where the Hellkite Drake first shows up. You had said that there was another element of de Tocqueville that you wanted to kind of address or critique or talk about. Do you remember what that was?
I don't exactly remember what I was talking about, to be honest.
No, that's fine. That's fine. But what are your thoughts generally? Maybe you'll just get there naturally.
Yeah. So my primary critique is that he focuses on politics in a vacuum without taking into account class, social society, and economics, that sort of thing. And he's correct that there was a centralization and increase in state authority through the French Revolution, and that happened because of essentially out of necessity for the capitalist class, consolidating the revolutionary portion of the bourgeois class, consolidating its power over society. When you're looking at violent revolutions through history, the norm, looking at the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, is that there's some sort of and also the American Revolution, is that there's some sort of terror immediately following the revolution, and there's some sort of consolidation of power for some amount of time that's necessary to keep the new government and new class in power. And that's where... Go ahead.
What was the what would you say was the terror equivalent in the American Revolution?
Yeah, so this is never talked about because we like to pretend that American history is all rosy and super happy, but there was a lot of terror directed at loyalists. And we know some of it. We just
like tarring and feathering and stuff like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We just don't emphasize it as much because we like to pretend like it was a minor thing, but it happened on a very wide scale. And also, the Constitution itself was a consolidation of power, because the whole point was that the Articles of Confederation didn't allow the federal government to crack down on dissent in the way it needed to maintain power.
Yeah, right.
So they created the Constitution to centralize that power and maintain the authority of the merchant class, the merchant slaver coalition that had fought and funded the revolution.
Yeah.
At least the American portion of it, not counting the French portion of it.
Yeah.
And obviously I should clarify myself, there was a significant popular upheaval that, won the French Revolution. It was largely like the American Revolution. It was largely guerrilla fighters who did the actual fighting.
Right.
But the Continental Army, the Continental Congress, and the sort of official institutions that seized control and you could say like usurped or like co-opted the revolution was a merchant slaver coalition for the most part.
Yeah. I mean, so this is me having a working knowledge of both revolutions, but a lack of deep reading of either of them. So this is a legitimate question, but also I'm curious, based on what you know, would you say, I get the feeling that the French Revolution was far more, let's say, working class. At least the first French Revolution was far more working class, being really driven by, like, the storming of the Bastille and stuff, being really driven by the bread riots that was primarily led by peasant women. I can't really think of a corollary in the American Revolution which seemed much more like a straight up bourgeois revolution. Would you agree with that? What are your thoughts?
That's what we're definitely taught to believe. We are only ever taught about the founding fathers, the merchants and the slaveholders that wrote these fantastic documents that are so brilliant and that led our armies to minor victories.
Yeah, right.
That's definitely what's emphasized and what we're taught. There is a substantial working class element that is not taught. It's also not really that often written about. You really have to dig to find it because it's kind of buried. But for one, most of my knowledge about this is very loose because I learned a bit about it during my 19th century American working class history class, but that wasn't the focus of the class, so he didn't talk too much about it. I learned a bit about it from some of the Chomsky stuff I read, but he was using it in service of larger points, and so he didn't go into it in detail either. But I'm sure that if I did an in-depth research project, I would be able to more clearly lay out the working class elements of the revolution. But I'm going to try my best to loosely lay them out now because they aren't talked about very much.
Yep.
But the answer to your question is yes, they are. I can't say to what extent that, whether or not it was equally driven by ordinary working people as the French Revolution. That's hard to compare without having really specific numbers.
Right.
But one of the classes in American society that helped drive the revolution that isn't talked about, especially in the early stages, is sailors.
Oh.
So sailors were, one of their main gripes with the British was impressment, where the Royal Navy could at any time impress any sailor into service and kind of use them as like slave soldiers in a way.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And so they were a very revolutionary class, and they participated and were large parts, important key demographics in a lot of the shit that happened in Boston. I think they were also, involved in the Boston Tea Party and that sort of thing. They definitely helped fill the ranks of the Continental Army and the other militia forces that fought the revolution. So that's one element of it. There was also I remember from the class, he talked about like 3 working class groups that were key to the revolution. The one that I remember is sailors, but there were 2 others that I don't remember, unfortunately.
That's cool, though. I'll say really quick, the sailors thing is really cool because it's sort of like how people's popular understanding of pirates is completely wrong. Like that pirates were essentially the first democratic groups in like, modern history. Because they had charters on their ships where they had a hierarchy, but everyone got a share and everyone got a vote. Some officers got more votes, like the captain and stuff, but compared to the ships of like the British Navy or any of the navies, which were entirely authoritarian.
Literally, they drove the sailors with whips. It was
yes, right, yeah, exactly, yeah. So that's
and they certainly weren't volunteers.
That I didn't know that, and I didn't think about it, but it makes total sense that sailors would be a big part of the revolution, because it's basically like they would get out on the high seas and they're like, oh, there's no, we can actually do whatever we want out here, except for when they've got a whip at our back. So fuck the guy with the whip at our back, right?
Yeah. Man, I really wish I remembered what the other two classes he talked about were, but they're skipping my mind. The sailors are the big one I remember.
That's cool.
Yeah. And then there's also a lot of the actual, one of the things that Chomsky talks about is that George Washington's Continental Army really did not do almost anything to actually win the revolution. They lost most of the battles they were in.
Yeah.
They have a few keynote victories that we're all taught about in elementary school and that are made
Delaware
big deals.
Yeah.
Crossing the Delaware, Yorktown, all that stuff.
Yeah.
But for the most part, the revolution was primarily fought by the French and the American guerrilla insurrectionary movement, which were not in the Continental Army. These are like, I don't know, the Green Mountain Boys might be an example. I'm not entirely sure. But these are like guerrilla fighters carrying out,
defending their territory, basically.
Defending their land, doing guerrilla attacks against, these large armies, and doing hit and run stuff, not like engaging in pitched battles.
Right. With line battles and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're the ones that, made it so costly for the British to be in America that they couldn't continue fighting the war.
Man, that's dope.
More so than. Yeah, it is. It is actually it's a really badass history that we get to learn nothing about.
Yeah.
Because
the moral of the story is, and this is why I asked, because I knew that I had to have been wrong on this. The moral of the story is, anytime that you feel like you know something, if you learned it in American primary school, it's definitely wrong. Like that's pretty much the answer. Is like, no matter what it is, you're pretty much like gonna realize that it's wrong. So I didn't know all that. I need to go. Where's a good place to read about the American Revolution from that perspective? Like, is Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States a good place for that type of information? Or have you even read that book?
So. I own it. I haven't read it.
I haven't read
it. Really sad.
Yeah, I really want to, but I haven't yet.
Yeah. He's probably, from what I know, he's probably a good source. As I said, Chomsky goes briefly into it in a few of his books. I'll try and see if I can find my syllabus for that American working class
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I think also maybe email that professor, because he definitely will have access to that information. And it's definitely something I want to learn a lot more about, because we're taught all these reasons we're supposed to be proud of being American as kids, and then we find out that most of them aren't true. And it'd be nice to have an actual legitimate reason to be a little proud.
Well, not only that, but also I think more importantly for us, for you and I, who are trying to use this stupid phrase of the people at the convention, win socialism. I think that it would be better. Like, a lot of times the people will be like, well, that was France. Well, that was Russia. We ain't Russia. We ain't France. We're fucking America. And it would be better to be able to point to something and be like, well, what about this part of America? Pretty badass, right? It's not the thing that you're being told that it is, So it would be good to have those kinds of, and I feel that way about what I learned about the Civil War and Reconstruction.
Oh yeah.
In the class that we had together, where it turns out that actually there's a lot, and this is where liberals get this super wrong. There's a lot to be proud of in terms of race relations in the American South during the time of the Civil War, and it wasn't the fucking Union Army that was doing most of the liberation. It was abolitionists in the South.
Yeah. You're talking about like the people who went down after the war to like enact Reconstruction.
Well, that, and also the stuff that led up to it, and all that, that, like we talked about in the first one, that Lincoln was not an abolitionist until radicals who were, at least some of which were in contact with Karl Marx, pushed him to do that, and that a lot of the trouble that the Confederates were having was not with the Union Army, although they were having trouble with them too. It was with, you're describing, these guerrilla forces of abolitionists that were like showing up to plantations and just slaughtering plantation owners and burning their fields and shit, which is like dope as hell.
And there was also significant, slave participation in that entire process, including but not limited to, having entire regiments that get medals of valor in the Union Army, but also like participating in that sort of guerrilla warfare that you talked about.
Yeah, right, exactly. And I wasn't specifying, but that's what I meant. And so that's something that you don't hear about, and liberals get really wrong, where they're like, there was racism in the South, and everybody in the South who was white was a racist, and then the North was like, you can't do that, and then the South was like, we're gonna leave, and then the North was like,
you can't do that.
no, you're not. We're gonna keep the country together. It's like none of that is even close to accurate, and most of the abolitionist fervor that ended up turning the tide came from the South, or at the very least was equally South and North, because without that insurgency down below, it wouldn't have gone the way that it did.
I think it's also I think it would be a good talking point to say, oh, you don't like Marxism? Well, did you know that Marx was more of a patriot in the year 1864 than half the fucking Republican Party today?
Yeah, right. Yeah, more of an American patriot. Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. Anyway, yeah. So, I would like to go back to that, because the American Revolution has always been like horribly boring to me, and I think that it's because of how disingenuous the story is, and has always really been, and I didn't really realize it. I think that going back and because the Civil War was also really boring to me until I started learning about, the slave revolts and stuff like that, which is like, oh hell yeah, So like, I think that that's probably worth a revisit.
Yeah, on the subject of the American Revolution, I can't confirm this, but I've been told by other radical sources that, of the founding fathers, 99% of them merchant slaveholders, assholes, but I think Thomas Paine is supposed to be like the good one.
He's the real deal. Yeah, Thomas Paine was the real deal. Yeah.
And I really I own Common Sense, and it's one of the books I want to read this summer.
Yeah.
But I haven't quite done it yet.
Yeah.
I really want to learn more about him as well.
Yep, he was the real deal.
So actually, during the brief break we took, I did bring up my syllabus from that class, and I think I found a book that we would both want to read.
Okay.
It's called The Many-Headed Hydra, Sailors, Slaves, and Commoners, and the Hidden History of the Revolutionary Atlantic.
Oh, that sounds dope.
Yeah. I think I only got a chance to read like the first chapter in the class, and it was pretty awesome. So I'll send you this PDF, and we can. I found they have a free copy of it on what looks like libertariancommunist.org, which is pretty funny to me.
Nice.
But how it's probably awesome.
Yeah, if it's on libertariancommunist.org, it's good. I didn't even know that was a website.
It's called libcom.org and has like a red and black star, so I assume that's what it's supposed to be.
Libcom. I hate that libertarian and liberal both start with lib, and so you can call it, like, someone could be like a rad lib, that's like a radical liberal, or they could be a what's one with libertarian that I'm just blanking.
Fucking libertarian capitalists. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know, but you can abbreviate it either way, and that always bothers me because you have to have the prior knowledge of which one is being talked about.
Their website is so janky now that I look at it.
Well, yeah, I mean they're called libcom.org or whatever. Of course, it's gonna be janky.
Yeah. Yeah, makes sense.
They're if they invested in a really nice website, they'd be ANCAP.
I see. Yeah.
So what was your impetus to talk about the revolution? I think you kind of touched on it a little bit, like what the implications are for today. But do you have any more thoughts on that in terms of modern implications?
Yeah. So as for impetus, part of it was that I wrote a paper about this last quarter, and I made the notes easier to prepare.
Sure. Yeah, and it's fresh on your mind. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. And yeah, I guess there's maybe not too many people having complex historical debates about the French Revolution today.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Not as many as I would like, but
yeah,
I think it is a generally useful thing to know this history and understand how how transitions to different forms of societies work, because it definitely should inform our analysis today so that we can understand different ways to help build a socialist system. So now we know not only is it important to obviously do the actual organizing work, but there's also sort of materially determined cultural ways in which capitalism is also slowly deteriorating.
Yeah.
And one of the best examples of which being the internet, in my view.
Yeah. I
go ahead.
Well, if you have more thoughts, go ahead, because I'm gonna switch gears a little bit.
Oh, I was just gonna continue rambling on the same points. It probably won't add.
Okay, all right. So this is a tough one, but it's a conversation I really want to have, and so we could start it now, and maybe explore it, in a future sessions. But I find, and I'm really interested in your thoughts on this because you strike me as the kind of person I'm about to describe, but maybe not. So yeah. If you start it with a bunch of caveats like that, it's going to be bad. No, I find that I'm just going to be straight with it. I find that the appetite for violence on the left is far too low.
Oh,
no. No, I'm serious. Compared to where it needs to be if there's really going to be social change, because leftists really like talking about revolution, like the French Revolution or the American Revolution or the Russian Revolution or the Cuban, all of them that we like. The Haitian Revolution. Shout out to the greatest of all, the Haitian Revolution.
Haitian Revolution is awesome.
It's the best of all, yeah. But then when it comes time to talk about revolution today, suddenly it starts getting real pacifist, and that really bugs me because it makes me feel like all of those people are like cosplaying as revolutionaries, where it's like, no, well, all those people in the past had to use violence, but we won't have to. And I just I'm interested in what you think about the role that violence plays in these historical things and also in any future revolutionary action.
Yeah.
Violence, of course, doesn't always have to mean killing people. It can mean violence against the state, like as in violence against property, violence against, the means of production, things like that, But
yeah. No, this is definitely a complicated question.
Yeah.
And you do know that roughly where I stand.
I think I do. I think I do.
Yeah. But I'll expand on it. So I think that what the first myth to dispel is that there's such thing as social change without violence.
Right.
And this, you agree with me there, but you might, disagree with where the exact direction I take this. But
of course,
for example, the civil rights movement, we think of that as being pacifist.
But it wasn't.
And well, there was definitely So there was, on the part of the actual activists and people that won it, violence was in the minority, but it was opposed with violence everywhere. It was not a peaceful event.
Yeah, no,
The
I'm gonna
yeah
I'm gonna push back on that. That isn't true. That's another one of those things, like the way that we teach the American Revolution. The tactics used during the civil rights movement were at the very least 50-50 violent nonviolent.
mm-hmm.
And without the violence, the nonviolence would not have been sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
So I will push back against that idea.
Mm-hmm. Well, my understanding is that, and this could be wrong, I have not taken a class on that specific era.
Right.
That's kind of one of the bigger gaps in my historical knowledge that I'm
right.
very disappointed. But my, basic understanding is that the violent portion is a minority, but that could be wrong. I could have to learn more.
Yeah.
I'm willing to acknowledge that.
Well, I will say that really quick, and this is also true of the Indian revolution with Gandhi too, where everybody says that was nonviolent, and it wasn't. A million.
There's definitely
a million
state violence.
Yeah, a million people died, but whatever. Super nonviolent. But no, I mean, and for all the liberals that love quoting Martin Luther King, they sure don't like the parts where he condones violence, which he does often, especially when he is talking about riots are the language of the unheard. I mean, like he is saying that what he's doing is mostly nonviolent, but he's also saying there is going to be violence, and it should be expected, and no one should be, surprised or poo-pooing it, because that's the way that this works. It's just not what I'm doing,
Yeah, I guess I follow that sort of train of thought where I don't really shit on the people who were part of the BLM riots over the past, like in the past year.
Right.
They're not my enemies. I know that.
Right.
It's just not my lane.
Yeah.
To an extent.
Yeah. Yeah.
But to expand on that, one of the questions I do want to answer that you had that is freshest in my mind was the role of violence in whatever revolutionary movement happens in the future, assuming it happens.
Right.
I think that part of what makes the left powerful is being able to provoke the capitalist class to initiating violence. In my view, I think that the most likely route that violence would happen in the future would be in the capitalist reaction to a popular movement.
Well,
so, like,
I mean, it already has.
It that happens constantly. But I mean, to a more successful popular seizure of power. So in my mind, what the historical event it would most clearly reflect would be the Spanish Revolution, the Spanish Civil War, where you had this popular movement both outside and inside the state, but also the Popular Front won elections, but that was hardly the only thing going on in the popular movement at that time.
Right.
And the reaction to that was an attempted military coup, which became a civil war. And I think that if there was to be revolutionary violence, it would be something akin to that, where it would be the popular movement is ascendant and making large strides, and in order to stop it, there's some sort of military and capitalist reaction to it to try and drown it in blood.
Mm-hmm. But what? Okay. But what would, if that's the case, right? So let's say that let's say that the 2020 Black Lives Matter riots were met with that level of violence, because they were met with the normal level of state repression, but they weren't met with that level of violence. Let's say that they were, right? Who do you imagine being the, for lack of a better word, frontline soldiers in that, and the coalitions that make up the fighting force against the state? Because I don't see really anyone aside from maybe the people that took place in those riots, which is not that big of a fighting force.
Not a large part of the population.
I don't see conservative gun-toting Republicans going against the U.S. military. I don't see or police. I don't see any cohort of liberals doing it. They love the state more than anyone. So I'm frankly I don't see any fucking leftists really with a sort of an eye or a appetite for violence. So I just don't even see how a civil war could even be possible.
Well, this is where we start to diverge lanes.
Yeah.
The reason that you don't see a civil war, a conflict, or a revolution as being possible is because, in my mind, from my perspective, you recognize the state has a monopoly on violence.
Yes.
And that the only groups that come even close to being able to oppose that monopoly on violence are groups that are aligned to the state and the capitalist, domination.
I think that's true, but
let me clarify. I'm referencing like the right-wing gun-toting people.
No, I know that. I know that.
Yeah.
But I'm saying that, to a degree that's true, but what I'm saying is when the cops start shooting at people, at what point will there ever be a point at least in the American context where we will literally start shooting back, like showing up to protests with weapons, using our right to bear arms, and being, which is almost like what happened at the Chaz, but like, we're in what was it, in Seattle, or was that in Portland or Seattle?
I'm not sure.
I don't remember, but where it's like no, we have a fundamental constitutional right to protect ourselves from the violence of the government, and we are here to protest, and if police come close, we will shoot them. Like, I'm wondering if that ever will occur, or if there's any group that has an appetite for that.
I don't think there's any group that would do that today.
No.
But
yeah.
Speculating, I think that trying to cohere my thoughts here.
Yeah, for sure. And this is a tough one too, because it's a lot of speculation.
I'm hesitant to upload this one.
It's a lot of speculation, and it's also a topic that is, I think, the sort of the new like taboo. It's the new thing that people just really don't want to talk about and makes them really uncomfortable. And so that's of course where I'm most interested, because if it makes you uncomfortable, there's a reason why, and we should explore that,
So let me start off by saying that for the viewer, I am not in favor of, terrorism. I'm not in favor of violence towards innocent people. I'm not in favor of instigating violence. I do believe in self-defense, as I believe Patrick does. So, if cops are out there literally murdering protesters, I would be in favor of protesters defending themselves as necessary. So let me get that out of the way. And part of the reason why I, on top of moral reasons, why I am opposed to violence as a strategy and instigating violence as a strategy is that I think that we have the Second Amendment, and on paper, it says that, the people can defend themselves and challenge the state. I think that's just paper. I think that practically speaking, there is not any real hope that the people, the working class, whatever you want to say, could independently come to the point where it could challenge the state's monopoly on power. What I think needs to happen, and this is where I would get called an electoralist or whatever. I think that there needs to be some measure of control over state institutions by the working class in order to, in order to be able to stand up against the violent reaction to whatever our agenda is.
Yeah.
So essentially, what I see as needing to happen is we need to usurp mechanisms of the state through a working class organization, like, again, you have objections to DSA. DSA has problems. We can all acknowledge that. But I think something
like that.
to what DSA is supposed to be, a democratic organization of the working class, needs to seize control of state institutions through most likely some degree of electoralism.
Yeah, or striking or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, and use those state institutions to defend the agenda when the right comes to knock them out of power.
Right. So, also, I just killed that boss battle. But
hell yeah, you did that boss battle without dying.
Yeah,
that was pretty impressive.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, maybe the last little bit here to discuss then, because I think I agree. I think you and I, our overlap is like 95%.
Okay.
You know, on that, but
that's interesting.
There is I don't know, maybe 80%. But there's there is a common phrase that gets thrown around that I have comments about, but I don't want to say what they are yet because I want to hear yours first. Which is you cannot disassemble the master's house using the master's tools. And so in this case, you're essentially advocating for take control of government institutions, or just of social institutions, maybe not government, and use them against the oppressive state, which would be literally using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. What do you feel about that phrase and that sort of generally?
Yeah, so as a counter example, I would pose Marx's quote that capitalism makes its own gravediggers.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would say that I disagree with that phrase, and I would point to, and I could go into them in detail if that becomes something we want to do, but I would, in my knowledge of history, most wars, most like revolutionary action does not succeed without some sort of state mechanism supporting it. The closest thing to a counterpoint to that would be Vietnam.
Or
but
Haiti.
Vietnam was like the Viet Cong were armed and helped organized by the Chinese state, the Soviet state, and that they also had the North Vietnamese state, which helped arm those insurgents in South Vietnam. But all looking to the American Revolution, it probably wouldn't have succeeded without the French state's assistance.
Right.
Looking to, obviously the Russian Revolution was almost entirely statist driven.
Right. I mean, what about Haiti? I mean, like
Haiti.
I mean, that I don't know.
Haiti's also a good.
I don't know of any state actor that was. I can think of many state actors that were opposed to the Haitian Revolution, but I can't.
Yeah.
I can't really think of any that were strongly on board. So.
The Haitian Revolution is probably the strongest counterexample, and here's why I would argue that it was possible. I think it was only possible because France was literally at war with all of the rest of Europe at the time and couldn't have. So places like Austria and England weren't trying to aid the Haitians, but they de facto were by being at war with France at home.
Yeah, I think there's one other element of it. But you're absolutely right, and the other element I think is that it's on an island, and so it was
on the periphery.
Correct. It was on the frontier, and it was naturally defensible against any assault, unlike something that just shared a land that shared a border or something with another state that could easily just invade it. So
yeah, exactly. So that would be my counterpoint to the Haitian Revolution as well. Were there, I think you asked like 2 or 3 questions. I think I answered at least 2 of them.
Yeah, I don't know. I really, it's just like I don't see enough appetite for violence from anyone. I see a lot of virtue signaling on the right. The virtue signaling is my freedoms, my guns, don't tread on me, whatever. But then of course they suck the dicks of every cop that they can possibly find. And edit that out of the video. And no, but you know what I mean. And so like that's virtue signaling, where they're like, come and take it. And it's like, oh yeah, you're really gonna shoot a cop? Yeah, I fucking doubt it. Like,
Uh,
you fucking love cops.
yeah.
Whatever. Oh wow, that was a dumb way to die. Um,
Aw.
but
Are we at like 13, 14?
let's call it 13. I don't know if there's been one in between.
Yeah, that's fine.
But then there's virtue signaling on the part of liberals, which is what I'm talking about with this Martin Luther King thing, where it's like, oh, we want everything to be nonviolent. And it's like, fuck off.
Mm-hmm.
Like, everything you have is because of violence. All the privileges that you have, everything, all of the precious metals and plastics that go into your fucking iPhone, like everything you have is because of violence. And the fact that we have such a touchy sort of thing with violence where it's either like, I'll defend myself, or it's like, no, let's not do anything. It's like, what happened to liberation? Like, what happened to violence against oppressors and stuff? It just seems like it's been completely wiped out in the modern era.
Yeah. Ironic because, in the context of the American Revolution, we would glorify that, which is how this country was born.
Exactly. And so that's been, something I've been dwelling on for a few years now, where it seems to be a consensus among the American left and the American right, which is to say, just centrist liberals of two different flavors. Because I think fascists are interested in violence, and I think that that's actually a big problem in the future, because I don't think the fight is between conservative liberals and liberal liberals, for lack of a better word, and woke liberals. I really think the fight is between socialists and fascists.
Coming down the line.
And the fact that fascists are okay with using violence and socialists, as it stands right now, as a bloc aren't, I think is going to be a big problem.
I think that in order for, I think that there's probably a lot of truth to 90% of what you were saying.
Yeah.
I think that for there to be hope for socialists, we have to make sure we get the state first. Because if the other side has the state on top of the fact that they're already armed outside of the state as well, then I think we're screwed. But I don't think there's any hope.
But if you, I think I'm going to play the classic, because I actually believe it. I'm going to play the classic anarchist line, which is, if you can't, if the other groups are working in coalition, whether they mean to or not, to stop you from taking control of the state, see, for example, the most mild possible thing that we could have asked for, which is Bernie Sanders getting just absolutely destroyed by every single other group, then isn't that just sort of like hoping that magic will fix it,
I would dispute that. Yeah. And I think that's where a lot of our differences come in.
Right.
My first point would be, Bernie didn't end well. But historically, there are examples of working class movements taking state power. And, we're not in the position where we can do that tomorrow.
Right.
It might not happen for a while, but it's not a historic impossibility.
Yeah. It's not even. It's not even a contemporary impossibility. I mean, we're seeing moves like that in other countries. Yeah.
Yeah, and so, I don't think that it would be magical for something like to happen. I think it just takes a very disciplined and massive movement, with also at the same time making use of the working class's primary form of power, which is through withdrawing labor and like mass organization on the labor front, to even make winning state power possible.
Yeah.
So I think that it's a long way off, but I do think it is possible, and I think it's in the long run going to be necessary if we're gonna build a socialist society.
So then maybe as the wrap up, we can say, and we'll say goodbye to Thoughts and Prayers 2.0. Maybe we can say that sort of the revolution, the French Revolution lesson that maybe we can gain here is that at least part of a strategy of social change and revolution on a grand scale the kind of which we would like to see and feel that we need to see. Some interaction of some kind with the state is required. You can't just pretend that the state isn't there.
Yeah.
And there's some level of interaction with it, be it a provocation, reaction kind of thing, be it a seize the means kind of thing. But some level of interaction with the state is along non-traditional lines is going to be necessary. It's not just going to happen because a bunch of people just decide to vote different or just decide to think differently or whatever.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty sure I agree with what you're saying.
All right. That's it. Thanks for watching, everybody. Till next time.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.
Fuck you. Fuck you.